So I think it was a couple weeks ago, maybe even 3 or 4 weeks ago, when Patrick came up with the idea that it might be interesting to talk about what we mean about Dharma as this word that means truth and this thing that we take refuge in. And as I started thinking about it for this talk, right after this presidential inauguration that happened last Wednesday, where we changed presidents from the conditions we had the past 4 years. Talking about truth all of a sudden seemed like a big deal. And I hadn't realized how much I'd really compartmentalized the distortion of truth that happened under our last president until I actually spent 10 minutes watching a section of the new administration holding their first formal press conference on Inauguration Day last Wednesday. And the new press secretary, Jen Psaki, actually started her remarks wanting to talk about truth. And what she said was, when the president asked me to serve in this role, we talked about the importance of bringing truth and transparency back to the briefing room. And there might be times where we see things differently in this room. I mean, among all of us, and that's okay. That's actually part of democracy. And I don't know about you, but I know for me, like my body is still kind of shifting gears to feel how much conditions have changed. Just feeling how like there's actually press briefings daily who are that are trying to get as much accuracy as possible into the news system, even accuracy that might be uncomfortable or people might disagree about. And in the Buddha's language, how I understand how he thinks about Dharma, or how the Buddha talks about Dharma, is this is really an invitation to be taking refuge in the way things really are. So that's the political context that I'm thinking about. But Patrick, I'm also curious to hear some of what you're thinking about bringing us this topic tonight.
Yeah, the way things really are. Like, I started with thinking around, the places that truth shows up in the Dharma, the Four Noble Truths. There's suffering, there's an end of suffering, there's a cause of suffering, there's an eightfold path. It felt like very absolute truths. But this, like the truth of what is, I started to wonder about subjectivity and what does it mean to be a truth? Is there anything that is wholly true? So I started thinking about these teachings of the relative truth and absolute truth. The Dharma are, the truth, the absolute truth, expanding beyond. Our connection is our connection is clear. The truth is that our in ways that our identity don't is not challenged, right? That this absolute truth is this whole, to me, inspiring and very open idea that the ultimate truth is that we are all connected and we are all related and interwoven together, but that we have lived in these experiencing this relative truth, which is the world we live in, where we pay the rent and our identity do have a direct impact. And so, bouncing back and forth from absolute to relative reality causes me a lot of harm, a lot of stress, a lot of anxiety. I do a lot of work in trying to undo historic systems of oppression and to name racism in places. And one of the places I often see challenges when we miss each other. Right? It's like the relative truth is that as a Black queer man moving through this world, my experience is challenging because of the historical context and the systems of oppression and how they operate. That is my relative truth. And so in places where folks are focused on spiritual bypass, which is common in our tradition, right? To say like, well, I don't want to see color because I know that we all are one, to switch then to the absolute truth. Well, I feel like it negates that. And then I am in other places where I do a lot of training for folks around power and privilege and hierarchy, where people are identifying where does your power come from? And people often point to places like, well, I'm the CEO or I'm the boss of what I go says. So do a power analysis, like all the power lives with me. It doesn't land either. I'm like, actually, my power has nothing to do with your authority. My power comes from my history, my ancestors. My power comes from a place that you actually don't even have access to. And I feel like that is more of a absolute truth. And so just going back and forth between those two, really frustrating, and it's difficult. I think in this conversation, I would love to just open like that reflection and that conversation of like, the truth is that they're both operating. And how do we navigate that?
Yeah. I really felt this tension between relative and absolute realities when I was working with Buddhist activists during the Occupy movement in 2011. And I realized all of a sudden today, I was like, that's 10 years ago. So some folks might remember the Occupy movement. Some folks, that was like ancient history. But if you know something about the Occupy movement, the slogan, "We are the 99%, was this really electrifying way to consolidate vast coalitions of people against this mega power of corporations and multi-billionaires who are the 1%. And at that time, I was a brand new leader at the Buddhist Peace Fellowship as this movement was just emerging. And I was in a lot of conversations with long-term Buddhists who were really energized to push back on this slogan of the 99% with a message about absolute reality. They wanted to be like, no, we are the 100%. And I was like, I don't think that's what people are getting at. So it was actually really helpful to have this teaching from the Buddha about relative and absolute realities. They're actually talking about two equally important truths here. One is not more important than the other. And our practice is actually about learning to hold a paradox of being able to like see and be present with both of them at the same time. It's not one or the other, and one doesn't get to be more important than the other. So this is really helpful. Really, yeah, it's been an important teaching for me to talk through that political realm with the Buddhists.
Yeah, I think it's the bouncing back and forth. They're both true, and then how can I experience them in one moment? How can I experience two contrasting things in one moment? Or, through our practice, bringing concentration and focus, I think about, from single point of attention to luminous mind practices allow us to be expansive in our experiencing and our thinking that can hold both. I found from the Heart of the Buddhist Teaching, there's this, in the section about the two truths, there's a poem where Thich Nhat Hanh quotes, it says, "People talk endlessly about their suffering and their joy, but what is there to suffer or be joyful about? Joy from sensual pleasures always leads to pain, and suffering while practicing the way always brings joy. Wherever there is joy, there is suffering. If you want to have no suffering, you must accept no joy." It's like that invitation or that reflection towards the way that they are tied to each other. Suffering and joy are opposite sides of the same coin, right? Or that the relative truth, the other one, relative truth, and
Absolute truth.
Thank you, absolute truth, operate in the same way, that they may be opposite sides of the same coin. And if that is true, what does that mean for our practice as we draw our attention towards those places, as we hold spaciousness for contradiction, as we walk through the fact that there is suffering and there is an end of suffering? If you hold all these things at the same time, like we're really building skills to navigate the fact that both of those things can be true at the same time. And that, to me, takes a little bit of the pressure away from trying to decide which is true. They're actually both. Yeah, I'd also just love to share, I have a dear friend of mine who, Hannah Pearl, whose mother has been in Dharma. She's practiced Kabbalah for 40 years. She's been there. So we're sitting in her garden a couple of weeks ago, And we're just, you know, waxing philosophical about the Dharma as we do. And she was pointing to, I was sharing about how I was struggling with this idea of like, what is the Dharma? And I said, what am I doing when I have opportunities to teach and to share? I struggle with what is important and what's relevant. And her name is Lanny. And Lanny shared and said, you know, I think that you should consider that the word Dharma means truth. And so the Dharma that you're sharing is your struggle as you share your the difficulties you have in trying to reconcile the dissonance, your speaking truth to power, your commitment to expanding the Dharma teaching so that more people from your communities experience less suffering. Like that is the Dharma too. So it gets onto a wheel a little bit of like expanding and expanding until everything feels like the truth and everything feels like the Dharma. But I really enjoyed sitting in that and really just absorbing and contemplating like where are the places that the Dharma is the truth represented in my life. Yeah, and I'd love for folks, you know, I'd love to plant that seed and like start to have folks think about like where the truth of the Dharma lives in their life and experiences. Is that weird, Dawn?
No, I don't think it's weird. I think it's helpful for me to think about Dharma. It gets used in a lot of ways. So sometimes it's applied to talk about the ancient writings that have been passed down from like what the Buddha said 2,600 years ago. These ancient texts that contain beautiful wisdom, but it's also the Dharma wisdom from our own practice, from our own lives, that is just as essential. And I know for me, like I'm someone who rejected Christianity, the Christianity that I grew up in, because of some spiritual violence to LGBTQ folks in a church that I tried to go to in college. Kind of showing up to the church, and then at some point they were like, "Oh right, we like to try to heal gay people," and I was like, "No." So it took me a while to find my way back to spiritual teachings, and it made a big difference to me that the Buddha is really careful not to try to shove wisdom down my throat. Like there's a real invitation to come and see for myself. The word in the language of the Buddha is ehipassiko, this come and see for yourself. And it was incredibly healing for the kind of spiritual wounding that came to me through Christianity and can sometimes come through other religions that can be more dictatorial about what truth is and what wisdom is. And Thich Nhat Hanh, who you also quoted, says this really succinctly when he says, Dharma books and tapes are valuable, but the true Dharma is revealed through our life and our practice. And, you know, I think it gives you a sense of how we even structure our time together. In an hour and a half, our time for practice is really sacred. And this time where, you know, Patrick and I are sharing or other teachers share, it's really just a time to kind of point to places where you can practice some more and explore and figure out for yourself, like, is this true? Does this work for me? Does this make sense? So it really, to me, feels like we're not, I don't know, finding truth. It's like not putting all of my faith in gurus, but really trying to trust myself and develop my own sense of wisdom. That just feels like such an important part of this practice for me.
So good. It's got a little bit of like a chill. You know, one of our earlier conversations when we talked about this is like, how do we make sure this is queer AF? right? Like making sure that our things are relevant, and like what could be more queer than like leaning into our own truths as our experience, right? Process of speaking up and speaking speaking up and speaking out our truth, our lived experiences. You know, when I struggle to understand the precepts of, you know, sexual misconduct and to abstain from that's like, there was a time when I thought that my sexual behavior was misconduct
Mm.
because of how I was socialized.
Mm.
The process of going through and undoing that trauma that was put on me that I absorbed, that was really hard. But that was finding my truth. And it wasn't until I could lean into my queer identity that I really started to tap into more power. So like the truth was that Patrick, as a queer man, like the queerer I could be, the more authentic I became, the more powerful I was. That is the damn truth. And so, yeah, just also knowing that our queer stories are full of the truth. That when we're able to access that and share that in ways that work for us, that can be really dharmic.
Yeah, I feel like that's so important for me too in this. I know in early learning about Buddhism, for me, this idea of no self um, really rubbed me the wrong way. Because I feel like I came out late, and so I felt really strong of clinging to my identities. It feels like you're saying this important way that I am finding my own truth, of really claiming my own truth of who I am and becoming more authentic. And how is abandoning myself actually a sense of truth? It doesn't make any sense to me. And so I feel like it's been important to me to understand that sense of no self. It's helped me to see some of those teachings framed more as a sense of interconnectedness or community. Because for me, the point of no self is not to abandon all identity and to be like bland and a robot. That's not the goal. But really, the goal is to not be alone,
Mm.
not feel like I'm here by myself with nobody else understanding my experience and having me be so disconnected from the rest of life on this planet that no one can support me and I can't support anyone else. That's the sense of no self and interconnectedness that I'm going for.
Yeah, it's very beautiful. Um, I just want to name that it's odd to have such powerful, like I feel like I could just reach out and hug you right now. And that to do this on Zoom is complicated. I just want to name that. And so for participants tonight, you know, hopefully something that we've shared resonates or at least sparks a curiosity that you might investigate later. You know, Donna and I both have the intention of sharing something useful, and we hope it lands that way. And if not, then we ask for your forgiveness. It was our intention to be helpful. We're going to transition to a place for fellowship and to build community more directly. So Rachel is going to set us up into some breakout groups. And we're going to post these 3 questions in the chat and broadcast them so you have them. But the prompts are going to be for each of you to answer whatever feels relevant. So you're going to have about 15 minutes, which, you know, to do with what you please. Please do practice keep listening. That means not listening while someone's talking, figuring out what you're going to say. You can take time to figure out what you want to say before you share. Also, please, you know, make space so to make sure that people who want to share have time to share. So watch your time together. And yeah, just nodding back to the community agreements about practicing self-moderation in these spaces. So the 3 prompts are, you know, we talked a lot about the Dharma being the truth. What do you think about that? Is it resonant? Is it conflicting with some ideas you have? Be more curious. The second prompt is, what does it mean to support or take refuge in truth? Like, what has it looked like in your life to take refuge in your truth? And the third question is, where in your life are you holding the paradox of both absolute and relative realities? If you're familiar with those concepts, that might be something you've already thought about, but just inviting you to spend some time connecting, sharing, reflecting on these questions in some triads and maybe quads. So are there any questions before we break out into groups? Any access